All right, so we're looking at Roman numeral 3, prokaryotes, with chapter 15. And the prokaryotic cells, remember from our first half of class, are cells that are smaller than eukaryotic cells. They do not have any membrane-bound organelles, which that means there's no membrane-bound nucleus, right? They have DNA, it's just not inside of a membrane. All right, so the two domains that contain prokaryotic cells are domain bacteria and domain archaea. We'll go into those two domains in this chapter. But one thing you should keep in mind is that prokaryotes are everywhere, right? They're found wherever there is life and even where you don't expect life to be able to survive. If you go down here, right, you're going to find them everywhere. Places that you think are too cold or too hot or too salty or too acidic or too alkaline. That's our definition, right? If something's too extreme, that's extreme for us, but not for them. They're going to be perfectly happy in like a very acidic mud pool, right, in the mountains of Yosemite. So they're going to be very, very diverse. Their metabolism is very diverse, and you're going to find them everywhere. They are, in terms of biomass, how much they would take up on the earth, they're at least 10 times that of all eukaryotes. They do cause disease, right? They cause about half of all human diseases. However, just the pure number of how many there are, they're really more benign or even beneficial for the planet and for us than harmful. So let's take a look at some features of prokaryotic cells. Here is just a nice picture of the tip of a pin, and you can see each one of these little dashes. That is a bacterium, all right? So the word bacterium is single, one bacterium, and bacteria is plural. So all these bacteria on the head of a pin, or sorry, not even the head, right? It's the little point. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that they can actually arrange themselves in different, different groupings. Some cells like to be just one by itself, so that's single-celled. Some prokaryotes can form clusters. They like to live in little groups, and here's an image of that. Those are clusters. And then some bacteria like to form chains, and they attach themselves end to end, and that's called a filament. So when you look at filamentous bacteria, and you have a lot of them, right, you can actually see that because they form these strands, they're going to look like hairs or hairy, very filamentous-like, right? So a filament is like a thread, a string. Let's look at a biofilm. So biofilms are very, very common. In fact, in the environment, you would find most of your bacteria living in biofilms. A biofilm is a community of different organisms, microorganisms, that live together and form a mat. So they're going to form a film, right, that's made of living things, where the word biofilm comes from. So biofilms are very protective for these cells, because instead of being one cell sitting there on the surface of a rock and getting bombarded with UV light from the sun, or getting dried up if you don't have any moisture, that's very treacherous. It's a very bad life, right? You're vulnerable to a lot of external, the environment that could kill you. However, if you lived in a biofilm, you're going to be protected by layers of other cells, and you can maintain moisture, you can maintain organic molecules in this biofilm, so you have sort of a supply of food. You are shielded from things like weather or UV radiation, or so it's a very protective environment to live in a biofilm. So which is why you find biofilms most commonly, all right, in nature, or this is where you find most of your organisms living inside of a biofilm. This is an example of how biofilms are everywhere. When you have these ponds and you have a slippery rock, right, that algae that's growing there, that's not one pure colony of algae. That's going to be a mix of different mix of living things creating a film. So that's a biofilm. On your shower wall in your home, if you have soap scum buildup, there's going to be microbes living in that soap scum. That's a biofilm. on your teeth because you do have bacteria that live in your mouth. Overnight, your teeth get a little bit fuzzier. That's because they've had time to grow and form a biofilm on your teeth. And in fact, that plaque that you get, the dentist will have to scrape off sometimes, is hardened biofilm. And so that's kind of interesting to think about. It makes you want to brush your teeth, right? That layer on your teeth is just a bunch of bacteria. And then this is a image of a surgical piece of equipment that has these divots. And so this is why surgical equipment has to be very, very meticulously kept up. It has to be cleaned. It has to be looked at, because if you have irregularities or damage to it, these little nooks and crannies can actually start to form biofilms. And then the next time you use it, and the biofilms might shield bacteria from the chemicals that you're sterilizing the instrument with. And then if you use this on another person, the potential is that there might be some living cells here still in these nooks and crannies, and that could be a cause of infection to the next patient. This is a really pretty biofilm, I think. This is in Yellowstone National Park, and you can actually see, it looks like a lasagna, right? So you can actually see the different color striations in this biofilm, and each microbe that lives here is going to produce a different pigment. So you can actually physically look at this tiering, this layering, and see how organized this biofilm is, with what kind of organisms live there in what stratum or what layer. So really interesting phenomenon, right, and things to study. All right, moving on to, let's just look at number 2. We know that prokaryotes do not have internal membranes. They lack internal membranes. Number 3, they do have cell walls. They typically have a cell wall. It's made of a substance called peptidoglycan. I don't have an image of peptidoglycan, but just remember that word as being the substance that bacterial cell walls are made of. You know how plant cell walls are made of cellulose. So you want to remember peptidoglycan as a bacteria cell wall substance. You know what flagella are, so some of our bacteria can move around via flagella. They have a very diverse metabolism, as I mentioned before. And number 3 brings us to this, number 6 brings us to this slide, the 3 different kinds of shapes. So bacteria are pretty simple. They just come in 3 shapes. Coccus is a round ball. Bacillus is otherwise known as a rod because it looks like a little hot dog. And then spirillum is a spiral-shaped bacteria. So bacteria are either round, they're coccus, bacillus, or spirillum. And so sometimes when you hear the entire word of a microbe, so sometimes students will know Staphylococcus. So Staphylococcus is going to be a coccus-shaped bacteria, right? So this is also known as staph for short. It can cause skin infections. It can cause other kinds of infections on the body. And sometimes people will recognize, actually Bacillus is not really that widely. I was going to say Bacillus anthracis for anthrax, but that is, probably don't know that. Anyways, so let's move on to endospores. So bacteria or prokaryotes have the ability to go dormant and form a spore. So let's take a look at this graph. Very simple diagram. So what we begin with is called a vegetative cell. This is a living bacterium. So, nothing special, just it's alive. And then this guy can, if the bacteria can form endospores, it detects the environment as something that is changing and not favorably, right? So maybe the environment is drying up. Maybe the environment is, lacking the organic resources it needs. But when the environment is no longer going to sustain life, it can go dormant by forming a spore. So what a spore is that just a hard shell. It's a protein coat that covers the bacteria's DNA. The living part of the cell dies, and then you have this basically just a ball with DNA inside. And it's just really hard, really impenetrable, very, very sturdy and strong, and it survives all kinds of harsh environments. It can survive being in the hot heat. It can survive boiling. It could survive UV radiation. It's just very tough. So the spore can detect if the environment is changing, and if there's moisture and organic products there, it will actually germinate. So it'll become active again, build itself a cell and then become the vegetative cell again. So the process of forming a spore is called sporulation. The process of coming out from being a spore is called germination. Okay, so that's all you need to know. And just remember that this is not a reproduction. The cell is not making more cells. It's just becoming dormant and then surviving the harsh environment for that period of time. And then when it's ready, it can germinate and become an active cell again. So it's really just a period of dormancy. Do you know any bacteria that form spores? My little question here. So some people remember anthrax. There is an anthrax scare quite a few years ago now, I think in the 90s, where the members of Congress were getting mail with white powder inside, and that powder was anthrax spores. So some of the bacteria that can cause us to get sick can actually form spores. If you breathe those spores, or if you get those spores in your body, somehow eat them or get them under the skin, those spores can germinate and then form an infection in your body. All right, let's talk about reproduction. So reproduction is very simple. We're just duplicating the DNA inside of the cell and then cutting the cell in half. So this is called binary fission. It's not as complicated as mitosis, so there's no steps that you need to know. You just need to know that binary fission, you create two identical cells. So this is asexual reproduction. You're getting a clone. And for the most part, bacteria will divide in this fashion. It's asexual reproduction. In number 2, I say that they can also exchange genetic information to create some variation, because we know that it is unhealthy for a population of organisms to be all clones. So there are a few ways that bacteria can actually exchange genetic information. I won't go into that, but if you are a pre-nursing student and you're going to take microbiology, you'll learn it then. All right, so let's talk about nutrition. How do all forms of life, not just microbes, right, but all forms of life get their nutrition? So this little box, there are two parts to these words. One is, how do your organisms obtain their energy? And this is energy to drive chemical reactions, right? So is your energy obtained from light, or is your energy obtained from chemicals? So phototroph refers to light, right? So we already know that plants, or any photosynthetic organism, is going to fall under this category because they get energy from light. And chemotrophs are going to have to break down organic molecules from outside. So humans, right, we have to eat food for our energy source, food being a chemical. So we fall into this category of chemotrophs. Troph is, by the way, a feeding suffix. So now you will have to think about obtaining carbon. Where do you get your carbon to build your body, or to run, to create different molecules, right? Organic molecules. If you can build your own organic molecules from inorganic starting compounds, then you are called an autotroph, right? So we again think about plants. Plants are autotrophs. They can take carbon dioxide and water, which are both inorganic, to make organic molecules like sugar. Heterotrophs are like us. We need to eat something, right? We get our organic molecules from other organic molecules from ingesting them. So we would fall under heterotroph. So you can put these 4 terms together, and that's what the box did. So what does the word, so hopefully you can see that this is the energy source. Do you get it from light, or do you get it from chemicals? This is your carbon source. Do you get it from inorganic precursors, or do you get it from organic compounds, right? So so in this box, you get your energy from light and your carbon from inorganic. So this would be basically your autotrophs. So this would be a photoautotroph, right? Plants are photoautotrophs. Well, let's go down. This is a weird box because this doesn't make intuitive sense, because we're not around these kinds of organisms on a day-to-day basis. But there are organisms out there that use light for energy. So they're photo. However, they need to dissolve organic molecules from the outside and bring them in. So they don't make their own organic molecules. These are called photosyntheticists. heterotrophs. Okay. Then on the other side, if you get your energy from breaking down chemicals like food, then you're chemo. And then some chemo organisms are autotrophs, so they can actually take in inorganic molecules from the atmosphere or from their surface, like rocks, for example, and they can build their own organic molecules. Okay, so chemoautotroph. This is another weird box because we're just not around organisms that do this. So then there's this. This is going to make lots of sense because this is what we fall into. We use chemicals, right, food for energy to make ATP, and then we also need to get our organic molecules from outside. So we are a chemoheterotrophs, and actually all animals are chemoheterotrophs. Okay, so that's how you want to remember that. So you want to make sure you remember the suffix, what it means, the photo versus chemo, and you want to make sure you know that sorry, did I say suffix? Prefix. Photo versus chemical, and then suffix auto versus heterotrophs, right? Keep those straight. So let's take a look at our concept check. How would you classify a new alien species that can create ATP from sunlight and only drinks Starbucks caramel soy ice lattes for its carbon source? All right, so we are getting energy from the sun, so we were looking for photo, right? So we're photoautotroph or photoheterotroph. The carbon source is coming from a Starbucks drink, which is an organic substance, not inorganic, and that is heterotroph. So this alien would be a photoheterotroph. Of course, maybe some of you can argue that Starbucks caramel soy ice latte is not organic. I don't know. All right, so we'll stop there.